Now, the way we divide up the APIs is by sector. And this is deliberate to allow for a cross-sectoral model where not every data holder will implement every API. Obviously, there'll be no obligation for banks to implement energy endpoints or energy retailers to implement banking endpoints. So what we have in the binding standards, which is in this formal site here, is we have the banking APIs. You can go and have a look at them if you like. We have them all under /banking to indicate the sector they're a part of. However, the thing I wanted to highlight here is the common APIs. So /common indicates that these are cross-sectoral APIs depending on designation. Now, customer data is designated for the energy sector. It is also designated for the banking sector. We anticipated this. So we actually, for the banking sector, created the customer APIs as cross-sectoral endpoints. The reason for this is that a customer represents an individual or business. It doesn't represent an energy customer or business. It represents an Australian person or business. So there's no point having the bank version of that, the energy version of that, etc. So what we've done is we've got a generic customer API here, common customer API here, that we'll be using for each sector for which customer data itself is designated. We also have down here admin APIs, and the admin APIs are for things like interacting with the register, metrics, things of that nature. We also have under here, I believe, I think they're under the common APIs, we have status and outages, which are unauthenticated APIs in that they are able to be called publicly, but they indicate the current status of an implementation or whether any planned outages are in the future, so data recipients can plan accordingly. So the common APIs and the admin APIs will be in scope for the energy retailers implementing for the energy sector. Mike referred to the authorization scopes. We have a model for allowing for high granularity scoping of data. We've been consulting in various contexts on finer granularity of permissioning, but we haven't actually implemented it yet because there hasn't been a use case for it. But at the moment, what we do is we have high-level scopes. Here they all are, and we have got a set defined for the energy sector along the same lines. And in each of these scenarios, these relate to one or more endpoints. We don't have endpoints, we don't have paths or APIs, whatever you'd like to use as terminology. We don't have them where they span half in one scope and half in another. We have them all in or all out. So if I have the scope of basic customer data, then there's an endpoint that I can access, and I can access everything under that endpoint. There's no partial payload. So you don't have to, like in your implementations, assess, well, does this individual field in scope? You're either got the endpoint in scope or not in scope. And I think in the entire standards we've done, there's only been one scenario where that's not been 100% the case. It was a corner case. But in general, that's the way we do it. You can do the scopes, and the scopes dictate endpoints, and then after that, you get the payload available for that endpoint without further need for scoping. So the data language standards that Mike was referring to each relate back to one or more of these scopes. Finally, we have the non-functional requirements. And so these are the performance requirements, the availability requirements, traffic thresholds, and so on and so forth that are applicable both to accredited data recipients, but also to data holders. We've just done a consultation on modifying these for the energy sector so that there's relief for retailers calling AEMO in that peer-to-peer model, so that that secondary responsibility is accommodated into the non-functional requirements. However, in general, the non-functional requirements will stand across and be cross-sectoral. So that's everything going through the standards here. There's still a lot more to show you. One of the things I haven't shown you yet is the actual draft energy standard. So we've looked at the banking APIs, common and schema. We've looked at the high-level standards. The draft energy standards are the ones that we've been consulting on for the last year or so. It's in a slightly different format because we were trialing a different format to see if it would be applicable. Once we make these binding, we'll move them into the other format. but essentially it's the same thing. It's a bunch of APIs. And here we have the endpoints. So we've got generic plans and generic plan details, and you can go through here and see all the payloads and fields for these endpoints. And these are the ones we're currently consulting on. All of these have gone through consultation, so they're actually pretty firm. These are not just made up out of thin air. We've spent over 12 months consulting on these over about 10 or 12 different consultations. So they are progressing and solidifying. And our goal at the moment is to have these to a candidate level. You can consider that beta, or you consider that, the 95% certain range by the end of October, early November. And the reason that's not 100% is really the standards never get to 100%. Even with the banking standards, we're still changing them as people implement more and they find more. But the real reason is we can't really solidify them until the rules are finalised. So one of the things that Fiona said in her section is that if the standards and the rules are not aligned, the rules override. The standards are built under the rules. So once the rules come out and are finalised and we know what they are, we will then probably have to modify our standards to make sure they match, because we don't have 100% foresight to be able to predict exactly where it's going to be. So when we talk about candidate level, that's what we mean. We'll treat it as if this is the standards, but then the rules will be solidified and we'll review them, and then we'll finalise any last tweaks. These are all the APIs here. You can feel free to go and have a look at those. If I go back to the standards here, there is one thing I haven't shown, which is the register. So if we click on CDR register here, it takes us to this page, which is maintained by the ACCC currently. And if I go and click on the design reference, we end up with a whole bunch of new standards here for the CDR register. Now, the intention of the CDR register is that the register holds the definitive status of accredited data recipients. If the CDR regime did not have accreditation of data recipients, then you might not even need the register. You'd probably just need a JSON file saying here are the data holders and where to find them. But the register exists for a number of reasons, but one of them is so that a data holder can definitively know the status of a data recipient. So that means not any company that implements some code can just go up to a retailer and say, I'm a data recipient, let me start sharing data. The register is, if you like, the source of truth of ADRs and their current status. And that status can change. An ADR can be suspended, they can surrender their position, they can have their position of accreditation revoked, in which case the rules have specific things you need to do as a data holder. So these register standards are very important. The other thing that for data holders is this is where you go and register your endpoints and go through conformance testing. The registers are, if you like, a really important entity in the overall standards ecosystem. And this is where you can find all the stuff you need to do for connecting to the register and using the register's data as part of the authentication and consent authorization flows. The CDR standards use a thing called dynamic client registration. Dynamic client registration means that once a recipient gets accredited, the DCR flows are actually part of it's an optional protocol under OpenID Connect. But what it means is an ADR can then come to a data holder and say, here I am, please create a client ID for me and register me as a client that can ask for consent. And the DCR has a whole series of flows, including calling back to the register, confirm identity, and then the data holder will issue a client ID to the ADR, and then the ADR will use that client ID to create consents after that point. I won't go into that in too much detail, but this is why I'm just trying to illustrate the importance of the register. We're actually in the process of taking these standards and merging them into the main standards site, because the feedback we had from the banking sector was that having multiple sites to go to got confusing. It would be better to have it all together. So we're currently in the process of doing that. So by the time you guys, the energy sector starts to come along and implement, we might have already merged that all together and you just have one place to go to. But at the moment, they are separate. Okay, so that pretty much covers all of the standards. there's the next thing I was going to take everybody through was how to get help and how to ask for them to change. But before I do, I thought I'd go through and just give you a bit of a checklist of if you are seeking to implement these standards, what do you need to care about? So I'll give you a bit of a quick overview. So if you're a project manager, this would probably be important. From a high level perspective, if you like, I won't say epics, that's too low level, but more, chunks of scope that you need to worry about. As an energy retailer, you need to care about tariff data. Now, you probably already have this organised because tariff data is about giving that data to EME and VEC. However, we also have the concept of tailored tariff data. So in the energy standards themselves, in the draft energy standards, if we look at say, get generic plan detail, these are the APIs to be provided by EME and VEC, and they have a lot of different information about the plan. But if we look at the account detail, you will see that account detail has this thing called plan detail with a lot of the same data in it. It has metering charges, and it has all the pricing and the fees that you would normally represent through EME and VEC. And this is in the context of, not the context of a plan I could get, but the context of a plan that I already have. And this is for comparison purposes, which is why we use the same structure. And there was a question asked earlier about, EME and VCE don't hold C&I data. Does that mean that C&I are out of scope? No, they're not. C&I are in scope for the authenticated endpoints. And that means that C&I plans are in scope in an authenticated context, not an on-market context, because EME and VEC don't have that data, but they are still in scope and the data needs to be held and represented. So that's a non-trivial part of the overall scope for an implementation project for an energy retailer. So don't forget about it. The other thing I'd say is that EME and VEC, Fiona mentioned the fact that C&I data isn't in scope because EME and VEC don't hold it. If they change their system so they do hold it, and that might require regulatory change from their part, but if they did hold it, they would start to have to share it because C&I data is in fact in scope. But that's further down the track. They don't hold it, so we're not doing it accordingly. But the reason I mention that is it's actually the topic of the consultation that's currently open. The next thing you need to think about in scope is authorization server, which is implementing all of the information security and register connectivity. You then have to worry about the resource APIs themselves, which are these beauties, the actual APIs and the logic for actually creating all the payloads, etc. You then have to think about the consent screens, which are part of the authorization flow, and very importantly, the consent dashboard, which needs to be presented in an existing digital channel and allows customers to go and revoke and control and see the consents that are open. And the final one to think about, and I'm not trying to be exhaustive, I'm just trying to highlight these are the kinds of things you need to think about, is your processes and call center. There are a number of, and this sometimes get left to last, but there are a number of aspects of the standards and the rules where it allows for, say, a consent to be revoked manually, as in not through a digital channel, but by calling up or sending a letter. In which case there needs to be an assisted channel, call center, colleague channel, whatever you want to call it, mechanism for managing consent also. The next thing I wanted to show, and we're on the home stretch here now, so I'm sure everybody's exhausted, but I wanted to show how we in the data standards body consult on the standards themselves. So the site I'm currently showing here is a GitHub site. We do all of this through GitHub. If you're not familiar with GitHub, it's a public website that's used for management of open source software. Most of your organizations, the engineers will be very familiar with it, and you may even use it for your own internal source code because you can actually get private access to GitHub for management of source code. So one of the reasons we used it is because in the industry, this is very commonly understood by engineers and a wide range of different stakeholders. And it's also a very good platform for doing the kind of thing we need to do. So if we look at what we're on here, we're actually on the standards repository. we have here in the standards repository a big README about how to use this repository, and all the files that I just showed you, all that standard site is actually here. So we make it all public. So you can see us changing this. So when we make changes, you can actually do the diffs on the commits. You can actually see what changes we did when, and you can look through all of our history. So we have full transparency on every change we've made to the standards. And we manage the standards changes through the issue tracker here. So if we look here, each of these entries represents an open consultation. So if I focus on the energy sector, you'll see that there are some say industry oil, and there are some that say industry electricity. And these ones are the ones that are specific to the energy sector. We have just this week published a candidate generic tariff endpoints. So feel free to go and have a look at that. We've still got one on energy non-functional requirements, which is still open. And we've also got NIMI standing data, candidate usage endpoints, and DER endpoints. We actually only have 3 left to do in the energy sector, plus the data language standards, and then to hit the November date. So we've actually been progressing quite quickly through the energy consultations. If I show you one of these consultations as an example, I'll take the, I'll do the generic tariff one. We include here a PowerPoint document, and that PowerPoint document is basically a proposal document saying this is what we're going to do with standards. Here's the decision to be made, here's how we're going to do it, and here's the current recommendation of the endpoints and what's changed. So all of our standards work this way. So this is how we make big changes to the standards, bring in a new sector, etc. However, we found for the banking sector, we got to a point where we were doing very, very small things. And more to the point, we were doing things that where the data holders and the community members were actually requesting changes. We weren't doing them from a central point trying to meet the designation and rules. So we actually created this thing called standards maintenance. So standards maintenance is a separate repository that works on a repeating cycle, an iterative cycle, and anybody can come in here and raise an issue. And you can raise a change request and request that things in the standards change. If I just pick one at random, adding support for given names. This was raised by Westpac, and it gives a description and the change proposed, and it's got some feedback and dialogue about this particular change. You can see by the number we have here, 322 closed, 81 open. This is a hot area. This changes a lot, but each of these is very small. Usually it's a field or two that's impacted, and they're very, very minor. To get visibility of what we're doing in the future, we also have this Kanban board, which has our quarterly plan. And this is how we track what we're doing currently. We're currently in this quarter here. We've got our next quarter organised, and we're currently working through these items as we speak. The DSP is doing quite a lot, so there's quite a bit in here. But if you want to know what we're doing in the first half of next year, at least as far as we understand, this is how you can track that. And finally, I wanted to show you, the last thing I was going to show you here is the Consumer Data Right portal. So one of the things is that we found going through the previous sector, and we've already found this to be useful in the energy sector, is that we get a lot of questions. And quite often those questions are questions that we've already answered before, because usually what happens if there's a point of ambiguity, more than one person is going to hit that point of ambiguity. So we get the same questions over and over again. So we have this portal that is managed by Jared, and we use this. Through here you can actually ask a question. And we track it like a trouble ticket effectively. And Jared hounds me and the other guys in the team to make sure we're answering our questions, because he's very much a customer advocate for you guys. And we answer those questions, and then he and the tech writers in his team turn them into articles. So you can actually see here a whole series of articles, and you can search for articles. We have different categories here. And this is an invaluable source of information. If you've got a question and it's to the generic standards, information security, etc., the likelihood is someone else has asked it. There's not a huge amount of energy stuff in here because the energy standard hasn't sort of settled yet, so we're not getting into that mode of supporting it. However, for the actual existing standards, there's lots of stuff in here. So please come here and have a peruse and look through it. There's some great stuff in the guides. There's some excellent FAQs, and we're just about to expand this out to include test cases to support testing regimes and regression test suites and things like that.